Hey guys, Humphrey here. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new to the channel, I make videos here on YouTube on personal finance and investing, and today I want to cover what you should actually know when it comes to working at a startup and just startups in general. So if you're fresh out of college or you're still in school or maybe you're thinking about applying to a startup, by the end of this video, what I'm going to share with you is my experience working at multiple startups, the pros and cons of working at a startup, and lastly, the things that you should know when you're applying for or interviewing for a startup. I've personally worked at startups that are about 10 to 15 people large. I've also worked at mid-sized startups where we had 50 to 200 people, and I've also been a member of a startup that was in the 200s and then eventually grew to the thousands of employees. In my time, I've also worked for a corporation, which was Bank of America Merrill Lynch, which I think is the most corporate you could probably get. So I have a wide array of experiences working at small companies, mid-sized companies, and also the large corporation. Both with startups and corporations, the experiences are completely different. So it really depends on what you're looking for. In general, if you prefer structure and stability, you might want to look at a larger corporation or a larger company that can offer you that. If you want more flexibility, you wear a ton of different hats and you might want to learn more, then maybe a startup is right for you, but the pay definitely isn't going to be as high, especially if they're a small startup. For example, I have some friends that wanted to get their lives started really early, which means they want to have a family and have a house as quickly as possible, so they actually preferred the structure and stability of a larger corporation because it offered them those benefits. Those benefits being job security, perhaps a little bit higher of a pay, and they always viewed work as a means to live rather than basically live to work. And so they really just preferred to work for a bigger corporation. They would know that their set hours are their set hours, and then they would go home at the end of the day and spend time with their family and their loved ones. Me, on the other hand, I love torturing myself, so I worked for a myriad of startups, basically trying to learn as much as I can and trying to get as many skills as I could and also wear as many hats as possible, because I knew that as long as I was focusing on knowledge, that hopefully somewhere down the line that I would start to see the return on actually that knowledge and those skills that I was building. You could even argue that I'm leveraging all the skills and knowledge that I've learned in my previous jobs in perhaps creating videos on YouTube. There are a lot of uncertainties when you're a young adult, especially right out of college, and I actually wanted to take a moment to talk about one of those uncertainties, especially when you start earning money, which is where to actually put your money. And that brings me to the next section of the video, which is actually a sponsorship. So yes, you heard that correctly. Today's video is actually sponsored by our friends over at Wealthfront. This is a partnership I'm particularly proud and happy to share with you guys. I've been using Wealthfront for quite a while now, especially their cash account, and I've gotten a ton of value out of using their services. For those of you who don't know, Wealthfront is a one-stop shop financial platform for anything banking or investing related. There's a lot of reasons why I love them so much, especially for starting your financial journey. Their cash account pays 8 times the national average in checking account interest. They have no account fees of any kind, no account minimum fees, no overdraft fees, no monthly service fees, and you can also order a debit card for your cash account, which allows you to get your money from over 19,000 ATMs without paying an out-of-network ATM fee. Also, if you're ever in a pinch for money, you can get your paycheck up to 2 days earlier without any strings attached. The only requirement to actually open an account is a mere $1. Wealthfront makes it effortless to open an account and start your banking journey with them. And when you're ready, you can even use the same platform to invest your money for retirement or plan for any financial goals you may have, like buying a new car, taking that dream vacation, or acquiring property. It'll be there for you when you need it. If you've wanted a financial service that favors people instead of institutions, I highly recommend checking out Wealthfront. You will not regret it. You can go to wealthfront.com/HumphreyYang when you're ready to upgrade your banking. Okay, now I want to talk about the pros and cons of startups so you can decide for yourself if you would like to actually pursue it or not. The first pro is that you're going to learn a ton. So when you work for a really small company, you might be doing, let's say your role is customer support, you might start to touch some other teams, like you might do some quality assurance one day or some marketing another day. So because you're being exposed to a lot of different types of tasks all of a sudden, I do think that this is going to be advantageous for you in the long run because you're going to figure out what you like and what you don't like. Second, if you do get good at what you do, you will get promoted a lot faster, and oftentimes a lot faster than any other corporation will ever promote you. For example, if you worked for a really large corporation, you might get promoted once every maybe year and a half, maybe every 2 years, maybe even 2.5 years. And that's if you're doing a really good job. Now, at a startup, I can tell you from my own experience, I was promoted, if I was doing a good job, I was promoted nearly every 6 to 12 months. Now, if your startup is growing, then you can actually expect to get promoted pretty quickly, especially if you're doing a really good job. And those promotions will often lead to more responsibility, more skills, more knowledge that you can leverage either at your existing startup or you can maybe take to a corporation if you really wanted to go join a corporation. The third pro is that the environment is usually a lot more fun. It's a lot more lively. There are less rules. So basically, I mean, there's still rules, don't get me wrong here, but it's not as stiff as, like, let's say working at a corporation. If you wanted to reach out to someone a little bit higher up than you at a startup, you could probably just send them an email, grab coffee with them, versus at a corporation, if you were to do that and maybe, let's say, go 2 levels up above what your current role is, you might be looked down upon or looked frowned upon because you're trying to go, like, circumvent your manager in a way. Now, that's one thing I really like about startups is that, one, you get transparent access to even some of the higher ups in the company, but also the hours are way more flexible than working at, let's say, a 9-to-5 corporate job. Depending on the startup, you can have wildly different hours. There are some startups that love to do 10 to 7, 10 to 6, 11 to 8 I've even heard of. The weirdest one for me was I was working at the video game company I was working for. It was called Machine Zone back in 2014 to 2016. And we regularly had employees show up at 1 p.m. or 2 p.m. and then just stay until 10 or 11 p.m. Now, not every startup is going to be this flexible, but ideally you do get some more flexibility when you work for a startup in terms of the hours versus when you work for a corporation. The next pro of working at a startup is that if you really care about what the startup is trying to do, like their mission, then it can be a really satisfying experience to work for a startup that is actually fulfilling their mission and going after their dreams. There are probably more pros than just these that I listed, but the last pro in my mind is that working for a startup is kind of like a lottery ticket. If the startup gives you stock options, you never know where that startup could go. It could go eventually to initial public offering or it could get acquired. And all of a sudden your stock options might be worth 10x, 20x, 30x of what they are worth initially. So working for a startup is really volatile. I mean, obviously you're gonna have some ends of the spectrum where you make no money at all, you just make your salary and maybe you don't get any options. But then on the other end, you might have a decent salary, you get some stock options, and all of a sudden your company gets acquired or it goes public and you make millions of dollars. That would never happen at a corporation. Sure, at a corporation you might get stock options and the stock might appreciate quite a bit. Like, let's say if you work at Apple and you get some stock options, then you've done pretty well in the last few years. But that really moonshot situation that I just explained in a startup, that generally won't happen at a corporation. So the cons of working for a startup are: 1, the hours can be really long. 2, generally you get paid less, especially if the company isn't super well funded or maybe they're in their first few stages of funding. They just generally don't have a lot of money to toss around for salaries, so expect to get paid less when you work for a smaller startup. The third con I think of working at a startup is that, well, because of all the flexibility, there's no structure. And because of no structure, sometimes it's kind of hard or difficult to figure out if you have a career path or not. And also that brings me to my fourth con, which is sometimes there's a lack of mentorship because the people that are working at the startup just aren't very senior in relation to you. So they might not be able to offer as much mentorship as, say, if you were working for a corporation and you were learning from someone who has been in marketing for the last 20 years. So those are some pros and cons. And now I want to talk about some things that you should be really considering when you're applying or interviewing for a startup. The first thing I think you should look for when you're looking at a startup is to figure out what funding stage are they in. There's typically 5 to 6 or 7 different types of funding stages, but they generally go in this order from least to biggest. But they have pre-seed funding, seed funding, then they go into their Series A, their Series B, their Series C, I don't know my ABCs, and then their Series D. So in general, the funding stages typically get larger as you go on. So when you're in the pre-seed stage, there's not a lot of money being thrown around at a startup, but all of a sudden when you get to Series C and Series D, that means the company's gonna be really well funded. The typical size for a Series C or Series D is well into the hundreds of millions versus in the pre-seed stage, it might be less than $1 million. So if you join a startup and they're in their Series C or Series D funding, that already means that they're a pretty mid-sized or larger startup and they might be able to pay you a little bit higher in salary, but their options, their stock options might have limited upside. Compare that to working for a smaller company like a pre-seed, a seed, or a Series A company. You're gonna have a lot more upside with your stock options, but at the same time, because you're there a lot earlier, there's gonna be a lot more risk and that business model isn't proven out yet. The second thing I think you should know about working for a startup is how the equity actually works. So let's say you get a job offer from a startup and they offer you 10,000 shares of stock options. That's really great. 10,000 sounds like a lot, but you need to understand how many existing shares are out there, because 10,000 out of 100,000 shares, yeah, that's 10%. That's amazing. But what if it's 10,000 out of 37 million shares, or 10,000 out of 100 million shares? It all of a sudden doesn't seem that lucrative anymore. So this is something you shouldn't be afraid to ask the recruiter or whoever's giving you the job offer is, hey, how many existing shares are out there? Because if you don't know how many existing shares are actually circulating within the startup itself, then your 10,000 shares could be meaningful or they could be meaningless. The third thing that you should really pay attention to when you're applying for a startup is to get a sense of what the work culture is like and if people are actually happy working at that startup. Some startups are really hardcore with their work. They expect you to be working all the time, on call all the time, especially on the weekends. And some startups are a little bit more lax. They have more of a work-life balance schedule, and that generally comes from the higher ups. Just make sure that the work culture fits your style, or else you might get to a point where you're not really enjoying your time working at that startup. Another thing that you should be inquiring about, especially at a startup, is basically figuring out where the role could lead to. Because of what I said in my cons section, a lot of startups don't have a lot of structure and they don't have a lot of set career progressions for a lot of the roles that they're hiring for. So in your interview, you're gonna definitely wanna ask them, hey, where do you see my role leading to in the next 3 to 4 years, especially if I were to actually accept this role and get this role? This is a two-pronged question, which is kind of nice. One of the prongs works in your favor. Basically, you're letting them know that you want to be there for 3 to 4 years, which is always a benefit of asking this question. And also you get to figure out, hey, where's this role going to lead to in the next few years? Anyways, guys, this was just a really quick summary on the pros and cons of working at a startup, what it's like to work for a startup, and some of the things that you should actually consider when working for a startup. So I hope that you enjoyed this video, and thank you again to our video sponsor today, which was Wealthfront. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see more content like this. So basically anything like on careers, Silicon Valley, or startups, I'd love to hear from you guys. Make sure to like the video and also tap that subscribe button. You can tap it hard or you can tap it lightly, but either way, if you do tap it, it's free, number one. And number two, you'll be subscribed to me so you get more videos from me in the future. Feel free to follow me on Instagram. My handle there is Humphrey Talks. So if you're just bored scrolling your phone and you want to come see more of me, that's where I'll be. If you'd like 2 free stocks from Webull, valued up to $1,600, when you deposit $100, make sure to use the link in my description below. Lastly, thank you to all my Patreon supporters. I appreciate you guys being here. And lastly, thank you for watching another video of mine. I really appreciate it. So I'm so happy that you're here. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.